Ethan Carver hadn't cried in 10 years, not when his marriage fell apart, not when Sandra packed her bags and said, "You were never really here," but standing in the doorway of room 214, watching his 6-year-old daughter sleep beneath the hum of hospital machines, something cracked open inside him. Because the doctor writing notes at Sophie's bedside, calm hands, familiar curve of her shoulder, was Claire Bennett, the girl he'd let walk away a decade ago without a single word to make her stay. What do you say to the one you never stopped loving? There is a version of Ethan Carver that most people know, the one who walks into a conference room and owns it before he says a single word. The one who turned a 2-person consulting firm into a $60 million operation by the time he was 35. The one who speaks at Harvard Business School twice a year and gets standing ovations from people twice his age. His name appears in financial journals. His handshake closes deals. His instincts, colleagues say, are almost inhuman. The way he reads a room anticipates resistance and finds the exact right moment to move. By every measurable standard, Ethan Carver is a man who knows what he's doing. But there is another version of Ethan Carver, and that one is considerably harder to look at. That version sits alone in a 3-bedroom house in Brookline every night after his daughter falls asleep, nursing a glass of bourbon he doesn't really want with the television, on a channel he isn't watching. That version got divorced 2 years ago, not because of affairs or cruelty or any of the dramatic reasons people expect, but because his wife of 5 years sat across from him at their kitchen table and said something he couldn't argue with. Sandra didn't yell. She wasn't even particularly sad. She was just tired. "You love Sophie," she said. "I know that. But you've never been fully here with me, Ethan. Not once. Your heart is somewhere else, and I don't think it's ever coming back." He didn't say a word, not because he disagreed, but because she was right, and they both knew it, and there was nothing left to add. He threw himself into work after that, the way men like him always do. He took more clients, flew more often, filled every hour with something productive and billable. His assistant once remarked that he had become the only person she knew who scheduled his own breathing. He laughed at that, which surprised them both. He hadn't laughed at much for a while. Sophie became his anchor school drop-offs, bedtime stories, Saturday mornings at the park with hot chocolate and no agenda. He was good at being her father. He was absolutely certain of that, at least, and certainty had become a relatively scarce commodity in the rest of his life. On the nights when everything else felt hollow and slightly unreal, he would stand in the doorway of her room and watch her sleep, and the slow rise and fall of her small chest would be enough to get him to morning. He had organized his life into a shape that worked, not joyful exactly, but functional, manageable, safe. He had stopped questioning whether that was enough, because questioning it was not a productive use of time, and Ethan Carver, above all things, was productive. He had not thought about Claire Bennett in a long time. Or at least, that is what he told himself, which is the most common way of thinking about someone constantly. It started on a Tuesday in October, the kind of gray New England afternoon that feels like the sky is pressing down. Ethan had picked Sophie up from first grade, stopped for groceries, made dinner, supervised a bath, and read 3 chapters of a book about a mouse who wants to be a chef. Sophie fell asleep mid-sentence, the way she always did. One moment fully present, the next, completely gone. He carried her to bed, tucked the blanket around her shoulders, and went downstairs to do exactly what he did every night. Bourbon, television, quiet. He was on the couch when he heard it, a sound that didn't fit small and wrong and sharp, like a drawer being slammed in a room that was supposed to be empty. He set down his glass and went to the hallway, and he heard it again from Sophie's room. Not a cry, exactly. Something worse. When he opened her door, she was on the floor beside her bed, her small body rigid, her eyes rolled back, and her jaw clenched in a way that made every single nerve in his body fire at once. He didn't remember crossing the room. He didn't remember grabbing his phone or calling 911. What he remembered afterward was kneeling on the carpet with both hands around hers, saying her name over and over at a volume that started as a call and became something more like a prayer. The paramedics were there in 6 minutes. They told him she was stable. They told him to breathe. They told him a lot of things that moved past him, like water over stone, because the only thing he could absorb was the image of Sophie, small and pale on that gurney, an oxygen mask covering half her face, her eyelids still fluttering with something that looked disturbingly like effort. The drive to Boston General in the front seat of his car, following the ambulance's red tail lights through wet streets, was the longest 7 minutes of his adult life. At the hospital, they ran tests for 2 hours, while Ethan sat alone in a waiting room that smelled of old coffee and industrial cleaner and someone's microwaved soup. He called Sandra. She arrived within 20 minutes, still in her work clothes heels, and all which told him she'd come straight from her office without stopping. They sat side by side, without speaking, in the particular silence of two people who used to be married and now share only a child, not hostile, just reduced to the single thing that still fully mattered to both of them. It was the pediatric attending who finally came to find them just past midnight and told them that a preliminary scan had flagged a small abnormality near the base of Sophie's brain. Likely nothing dangerous, but it needed to be reviewed by a specialist first thing in the morning. Ethan nodded. He thanked the doctor. He sent Sandra home because one of them needed to sleep, and it wasn't going to be him. He went into Sophie's room, pulled the plastic chair beside her bed until it was close enough that he could reach her hand, and did not sleep at all. He sat listening to the machines and watching the small, steady pulse at her throat. And outside the window, the city went on being the city indifferent and lit up and continuous the way cities always are. The specialist arrived at 7:45 the next morning. Ethan heard the door and stood out of instinct, the reflex of a man who always stands to meet whoever enters the room. He was prepared for a stranger. He was prepared for a formal handshake and clinical language, and the kind of careful neutrality that doctors carry like equipment. He was not prepared for Claire Bennett. She came in looking at the chart, not the door, and so she didn't see him for a full 3 seconds. Long enough for Ethan to take her in without armor, the same posture he remembered, shoulders straight, chin slightly lifted, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who is absolutely certain of where she belongs. Her hair was shorter now. There were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. She was 37 years old, and she looked to him exactly like herself. Then she looked up, and for 1/2 second, the clinical composure slipped. Just 1/2 second. Then it was back, sealed tight, and she crossed the room to Sophie's bed, as if Ethan were simply the father of her patient. Which, of course, he was. "Dr. Bennett," she said, extending her hand. "I've been assigned to Sophie's case." Her voice was exactly as he remembered it, and that detail did something unforgivable to his chest. He shook her hand. Her grip was firm, professional. She turned to Sophie before he had to figure out what to say next, and spent the next 10 minutes doing exactly what she'd been trained to do, checking responses, reviewing overnight readings, asking Sophie gentle questions about whether her head hurt or she'd felt dizzy before. Sophie, who had bounced back from the previous night with the infuriating resilience of a 6-year-old, decided she liked this new doctor immediately. "You smell like my grandma's hand lotion," she told Claire with complete seriousness. Claire laughed, a real one, unguarded, and said that was the best compliment she'd gotten all week. Ethan watched this exchange from 3 feet away and felt something shift dangerously in the floor beneath him. When Claire stepped into the hallway to review the imaging with the attending, Ethan followed. He needed to know what they were dealing with. That was the reason. That was the only reason. Claire explained the scan results clearly, and without softening anything which he appreciated. The mass appeared small and likely benign, but the location required thorough evaluation before they could be certain. It might take several days of additional testing. She would be overseeing the process personally. She met his eyes when she said this, and her expression was entirely even. and he understood that she was drawing a line clearly and professionally, and that he was expected to stay on his side of it. "Thank you," he said, "for taking her case." "Of course," Claire said. She looked back at Sophie's door. "She's funny, your daughter." There was something in her voice when she said it, not warmth, not coldness, but something between them that he couldn't name. Then she was gone down the hallway, and Ethan stood there for a moment, before going back to his daughter. He had not handled the first encounter badly, he thought. He had been composed. He had been appropriate. He had not said any of the 1,000 things suddenly crowding the back of his throat, which was probably for the best, because he wasn't entirely sure what they were yet. The days that followed had a strange, suspended quality, the way time moves differently inside hospitals, unhooked from the ordinary rhythms of the world outside. Meetings got rescheduled. Deadlines got quietly absorbed by his team, who had seen him navigate enough crises to know when to leave him alone. He spent most of each day at Boston General going home, only to shower and change and stand for a few minutes in the strange silence of a house that felt emptier than usual, without Sophie's shoes kicked off by the front door. The waiting was its own kind of wait. He managed it the way he managed everything, by staying useful, asking precise questions, writing down the answers, and redirecting any spare emotion into something that looked like competence. He and Claire developed a careful routine. She would stop by Sophie's room each morning, and each evening review the overnight readings, explain the next steps in language that was clear without being condescending. He would ask questions. She would answer them. They were both very good at keeping it professional, and the effort of maintaining that register hour after hour, day after day, was quietly exhausting in the way that sustained performance always is. Sandra came by most afternoons reliable and composed, and when their paths crossed Claire's in the hallway, there were polite introductions and nothing more. But one afternoon, after Claire had delivered the day's update and left the room with the same measured efficiency she brought to everything, Sandra stayed a moment at the window. Ethan was gathering his jacket. He felt her looking at him before she spoke. "That's her, isn't it?" Sandra said. It wasn't a question. He didn't answer. She studied his face for a long moment, the way she used to when she was measuring the distance between what he was saying and what he actually meant. Then she exhaled slowly. "Well," she said. "There it is." She didn't say anything else, and he didn't ask her to, because they had been through enough together to know when a subject was both perfectly clear and completely untouchable. Sophie, for her part, had no complicated feelings about any of this. She had decided that doctor. Claire was her second favorite person at the hospital after the orderly named Dennis, who sometimes brought her extra chocolate pudding and let her press the elevator buttons. She asked Claire questions about her stethoscope, whether it was cold when you put it against someone's skin, whether she had a cat, whether she had a dog, whether the ceiling tiles had holes in them because someone had poked them, or because they were made that way. Claire answered every single question with full attention and no condescension, the way you do with children when you actually enjoy talking to them, rather than simply tolerating them as an occupational requirement. Ethan watched this from across the room and felt each time the same quiet and dangerous shifting beneath his composure, like something that had been packed carefully for 10 years, developing a slow, irreversible leak. On the fourth evening, Sophie fell asleep early, worn out from a longer round of testing. The room was quiet. Ethan had been there since morning and hadn't eaten since noon, and was running on coffee and the specific stubbornness that had gotten him through every difficult thing in his adult life. He was sitting in the chair beside Sophie's bed when Claire came in for her evening check. She took one look at him and said with clinical bluntness, "You should eat something." He said he was fine. She said, "That's not what I asked." She pulled the second chair from beside the window and sat down, which was unusual, and for a moment, they both just listened to the machines and Sophie's slow, even breathing. "She looks like you," Claire said quietly, looking at Sophie. The expression she makes when she's thinking about something. It's exactly yours. Ethan looked at his daughter's sleeping face. He hadn't noticed that before. He wasn't sure how to feel about Claire noticing it. The silence between them was no longer professional. It had shifted into something older and more complicated, the kind of silence that exists between people who once knew each other very well and haven't forgotten it, no matter how many years of careful distance they've maintained. Neither of them moved to break it for a long time. It was on the 5th night that the real conversation finally happened. Ethan had gone down to the hospital cafe, gotten a sandwich he didn't have much appetite for, and come back to find Claire still at the nurse's station working late. Sophie was asleep. The hallway was quiet. He brought Claire a coffee without being asked, set it on the counter, and sat down in the empty chair beside her station. She looked at the coffee. She looked at him. She didn't tell him to leave. They talked about small things. First, Sophie's latest results, which were encouraging the particular misery of Boston weather. In October, a medical conference Claire had attended in September, where someone had given a 45-minute presentation about a study that could have been an email. It was careful conversation, the kind that circles the real subject without landing on it, the way you walk around a campfire, to feel the warmth from different angles without committing to standing still in front of it. But the longer they sat in that quiet corridor, the fluorescent lights humming above them, the hospital settling into its nighttime sounds, the less energy either of them had left for the performance of normalcy. It was Claire who finally set her pen down, wrapped both hands around the coffee cup, and said without looking at him, "I used to wonder what I'd say to you if I ever saw you again." "What did you come up with?" Ethan asked. "Nothing useful," she said. "Turns out I'm significantly better at diagnosing other people's problems than processing my own." There was a dry edge to it that he recognized immediately. She had always done that, used a thin layer of humor as a kind of advance notice before saying something true. She drank the coffee. The machines hummed somewhere down the hall. "How long have you been divorced?" she asked, and the directness of it after days of careful orbiting was almost a relief. 2 years, he said. "You knew, Boston's not that big," she said, "and people talk." She turned the cup in her hands. "I'm sorry about Sophie, about all of it." She said the last part with a specificity that made it clear she was not only talking about Sophie. He looked at her, then really looked at her the way he'd been disciplined enough not to for 5 days. The shorter hair, the faint shadows under her eyes that spoke to hours that ran longer than they should. The composed, steady quality she carried, that he had once mistaken for effortlessness and now understood, was simply a kind of practiced courage. "Claire," he stopped. He started again. "Why did you go?" he asked. "Not the reason you've told other people, the real one." She was quiet for long enough that the elevator at the end of the hall opened and closed. Then she set the cup down and said, "You know why?" Not accusing, just stating. "Dr. Harrington offered me the fellowship in Seattle. I told you about it. Do you remember what you said?" He did remember. He remembered with the specific, unpleasant clarity of something you have replayed too many times. "You said, 'That's a great opportunity,'" she said. "And I waited. I waited for the next sentence. For a week, I waited. And there was no next sentence." She looked at him squarely. "I had 2 choices at that point. Go or stay and make myself smaller and smaller until I fit into the amount of space you were willing to give me. I wasn't going to do that to myself." She picked up her pen, so I went. Ethan had no answer for that. He had known it somewhere below the level of words since the week she'd left, had known it more clearly, with every passing year, the way certain kinds of knowledge don't arrive all at once, but accumulate slowly until one day they're simply inescapable. He had been 27 years old and afraid of the size of what he felt, and he had dressed that fear up as consideration and given her his blessing to go, and then spent the next decade building a $60 million company and a failed marriage, and a very well-organized loneliness in the space that decision had created. "I'm sorry," he said. It came out quieter than he meant it to. "I should have said something. I knew what I wanted, and I said the wrong thing, and I have been sorry for it ever since. Not as an excuse, just as the truth." Claire looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. She said it without weight, without blame, which was somehow more difficult to sit with than anger would have been. She reached for a patient file and opened it, and he understood the conversation was closed for tonight, and he went back to his daughter's room and sat in the dark with the full inventory of what he had done and not done, and said and not said for a long, long time. 3 days later, the test results were complete. Claire called him into the consultation room on a Wednesday morning, and the news was good. The mass was confirmed, benign, presenting no immediate threat to Sophie's health. It would need to be monitored with periodic imaging, and there were a few precautionary guidelines to follow, but surgery was not indicated at this time, and Sophie could go home within 48 hours. Ethan exhaled for what felt like the first time in a week. He thanked Claire. He called Sandra. He went back to Sophie's room and told her she was going home soon, and she responded by immediately asking if she could get a dog, which he took as conclusive evidence that she was entirely herself again. He should have been relieved, and he was genuinely cleanly the way you're relieved when a fear that has been holding you hostage for 8 days finally releases its grip. But sitting with that relief in Sophie's room that afternoon, he felt something else arrive alongside it, quieter and less welcome, the awareness of what Sophie going home actually meant. Because the hospital, for all its fluorescent-lit discomfort, had been a container. It had given him a reason to be in the same building as Claire every day. It had created a structure around proximity that required no courage and no decision. They were simply both here as a matter of circumstance. Once Sophie was discharged, that structure would end. Claire would go back to being someone he used to know, reachable only by choices he would have to actively make, and Ethan had a well-documented history of not making those choices. He ran into her that evening at the nurse's station, and he told her all the appropriate things, that he was grateful for her care, that Sophie had clearly adored her, that it had meant a great deal to him, both professionally and personally. Claire listened with a small smile that acknowledged everything and committed to nothing. Then she said, "Ethan, I need to tell you something." The shift in her voice was slight, but unmistakable. The particular tone of someone who has been carrying a sentence around and has finally decided to set it down. He waited. She looked at the counter for a moment, steadying herself in the quiet way she steadied everything, and then she looked directly at him. "I got my own test results back 3 weeks ago," she said. "I have breast cancer, stage 2. She delivered it with the same calm precision she used to deliver everything, but underneath the composure, he could see what it cost her to say it, the small tightening around her eyes, the way her hand stayed very still on the counter. "I was planning to start treatment in Seattle, but I transferred back to Boston to be closer to my family first." The hallway went on being a hallway. Somewhere a cart was being wheeled. Somewhere a phone rang twice and stopped. Ethan looked at her face, at the steadiness she was holding so carefully, at the particular tiredness behind her eyes that he now understood had been there since the first morning, not from long shifts, but from something that ran considerably deeper. He had spent 8 days worrying about losing her to distance and his own cowardice. He had not considered this. "How long have you known?" he asked, and his voice came out lower than he expected. "Long enough to have a plan," she said. "I told you because you deserve to know, not because I need anything from you." He heard everything she didn't say inside that sentence, with absolute clarity. In the days that followed, he found himself finding reasons to be at the hospital, even after Sophie's discharge was confirmed. Small questions, follow-up concerns, things that could have been handled by a phone call, but that he chose to handle in person. He brought Claire coffee when he came. He sat in the extra chair and asked about the treatment protocol, what the doctors were recommending, what the timeline looked like. He asked as if these were purely informational questions, and Claire answered them that way. But on the third morning, she set her pen down and said with the directness that had always been both the most challenging and the most clarifying thing about her, "You don't have to keep coming here, Ethan. Sophie is fine." He said he knew that. "Then what are you doing?" she asked. He didn't have a clean answer. He sat with the question for a moment, and in the silence, she added more quietly, "Don't do this because of guilt. Don't do this because you feel sorry for me. I have enough people treating me carefully." She looked at him steadily. "I don't need that from you." He said he understood. He went home. He did not sleep. Sandra called that evening to check on Sophie. At the end of the conversation, with her characteristic refusal to leave difficult things unsaid, she offered, "Whatever is happening with that doctor, don't do it halfway. That's all I'm saying." She hung up before he could respond. He stood in the kitchen holding his phone and thought about how consistently he had managed throughout his adult life to be surrounded by people who were better at honesty than he was. Sophie went home on a Friday. She hugged Claire with the unself-conscious confidence of a child who doesn't overthink affection. Arms around the waist, face pressed sideways into her coat, and Claire hugged her back with both arms, and her eyes closed for just a moment. And Ethan stood beside the bed and memorized the image of it without letting himself examine why. In the parking garage, he buckled Sophie into her seat and listened to her narrate her requirements for the dog she intended to obtain, including a specific list of acceptable colors, a ban on the name Fluffy, and a preference for a dog who would be willing to sleep in her bed. He drove out into the October morning and told himself with some conviction that this was enough. He had his daughter back, and his daughter was healthy, and that was the thing that mattered, and he was not going to reconstruct his emotional life around a situation that had no clean resolution and was asking things of him he was not sure he was capable of giving. He was a practical man. He made practical decisions. He lasted 6 days. On the 7th day, he was in his office at 2 in the afternoon, in the middle of reviewing a client presentation that had absorbed his complete professional attention for the last hour, when he set his pen down on the desk and sat back and looked at the ceiling. The presentation was fine. The client would be satisfied. The quarter was on track. Everything was by every objective measure fine. He thought about Sophie's nightlight glowing down the hall every night, and Claire saying, "Don't do this because of guilt," and Sandra saying, "Don't do it halfway," and the 27-year-old version of himself who had stood at the departure gate of his own life and chosen the safe option, and he picked up his phone. He called Claire's direct line at the hospital. She picked up on the 3rd ring. Background noise behind her, the floor sounds of a busy ward. Someone's name called down a hallway. "Ethan," she said. Just his name, neutral waiting. He said, "I need to say something, and I need you to let me finish before you respond." A pause, brief and assessing. "Okay," she said. He had not prepared a speech. He had deliberately not prepared anything, because every time in his life he had prepared something for Claire, it had come out as the version that sounded right, instead of the version that was true. "I know I don't have standing here," he said. "I know the timing is complicated, and the situation is complicated, and you've built a whole life that had nothing to do with me, and I'm not pretending otherwise, but I have been carrying this for 10 years, and I am tired of carrying it, and I think if I don't say it now, I will spend another 10 years not saying it, and I can't do that anymore." He stopped. The office was quiet around him. His coffee was cold on the desk. "I should have asked you to stay. That night. I knew what I wanted, and I knew what losing you would mean, and I stood there and said the wrong thing, and I have not stopped knowing it was wrong since the day you left." He was not delivering a boardroom presentation. His voice was not entirely steady. "I want to be here, not because of guilt, and not because of pity, that's not this, but because I want to know you again, as whoever we both are now, after everything. if that's something you're willing to consider." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that he counted his own heartbeats. Then she said, "You know this isn't going to be simple." "I know," he said. "I'm not looking for simple. I stopped being interested in simple a long time ago." Another pause, and he could feel her thinking, could feel her weighing it, the way she weighed everything carefully and without sentimentality. "Sophie mentioned she wants a dog," Claire said finally. The tone of it dry and cautious, and containing in its restraint the smallest possible opening, did something to the pressure that had been sitting in the center of his chest since October. "She mentions it with some frequency," he said. She laughed, short and genuine. "I'll call you," she said. "This week." "Okay," he said. He stayed on the line for a moment after she'd gone, just listening to the absence of her, and then he set the phone down on the desk beside the presentation. He was no longer thinking about, and breathed. There is still no clean resolution to this story, because that is not how real things work. And this was never that kind of story. Claire began treatment in November, a course of chemotherapy at Massachusetts General, managed with the same methodical practicality she brought to everything else in her life. Some days were hard in ways that she described briefly, and without elaboration, which he had learned to understand as her way of saying, "I know you're here, and I don't need you to fix this." Some days she had energy and sharp opinions about his taste in restaurants, and whether his client strategy for the fourth quarter was too conservative. Some evenings she canceled, and he would drive Sophie to school in the morning and come home to the quiet of his house and just sit with the uncertainty of it, with the helplessness that he'd spent his whole adult life engineering his circumstances to avoid, because that was what being present actually meant. He stayed anyway. He was learning slowly and with some difficulty that staying was the whole point. Sandra, who was always going to hear about it one way or another, told him, "Be better this time." Not unkindly. Precisely. He said he intended to. She looked at him for a moment, the way she used to look at him in the early years of their marriage, when she was deciding whether to believe him, and then she nodded once, and the subject was closed. He understood that her investment in this was Sophie, that she wanted her daughter's father to become a person who could be fully present in the lives of people who needed him. He understood also that she was right to want that, and that it was a reasonable thing to ask of someone, and that it had taken him an embarrassingly long time to understand why. He was not suddenly a different man. That is not how this works. The instincts of a decade don't dissolve because you make a phone call. He still moved through the world with the self-sufficiency of someone who had learned early that needing things from people was a vulnerability, and vulnerabilities were to be managed. Some evenings he sat with Claire and found himself retreating into competence, organizing, solving, being useful in ways that kept him from having to simply be there as a person who cared and couldn't do anything about it. Some mornings he woke up, and the weight of everything, the uncertainty, the fear of what the next scan might show, the fear of loving something he might lose, sat on his chest until he got up and made Sophie's lunch and drove her to school and chose again to keep going. Claire noticed when he retreated. She didn't say anything about it. She just waited him out the way she always had with the patient, and slightly exasperated tolerance of a woman who understood that some people take longer to arrive than others, and had decided provisionally that he was worth the wait. What changed was not dramatic, and it was not instant, and it did not announce itself with any of the clarity that Ethan had always required before committing to a decision. What changed was something quieter, the fact that he stopped running the calculation. He stopped measuring the exposure against the potential loss and deciding that keeping his distance was the smarter position. He had done that his whole life. He had been excellent at it, and it had cost him everything that actually mattered. Some things are worth the risk of being wrong about. Some people are worth saying the difficult sentence out loud even when you're not sure how it ends. Sophie got her dog in December. Yellow Labrador, large-headed, selected from a rescue shelter outside of Boston on a Saturday morning when the temperature was 28 degrees, and Ethan had strongly suggested they wait until spring and been overruled by a 6-year-old with convictions. She named him Biscuit without a single moment of deliberation, as if the name had always existed and she was simply reporting it. He destroyed 2 throw pillows and a section of kitchen baseboard in his first week, and Sophie defended him against all criticism with the passionate loyalty of someone who has never once doubted the right decision. Ethan stood in the kitchen doorway one Saturday morning watching his daughter and this enormous disastrous animal tear across the backyard through the first thin snow of December, and he thought, this is it. This is exactly what it is. Not the optimized life, not the managed and protected and carefully structured life. Just this imperfect and real and fully irreplaceably his. Claire called that afternoon to ask about the dog, having heard a preliminary report from Sophie via a phone call the previous Tuesday. Ethan told her about the baseboard. She said she had specifically warned him about Labradors. He said she had not in fact warned him about anything. She said she had been warning him very clearly in her head, and he should have picked up on it. He laughed, and outside the window, Sophie threw a tennis ball that Biscuit joyfully ignored, and the December sky over Brookline was pale blue and cold and going fast toward dark, and Claire was on the phone, and none of it was resolved, and all of it was real, and Ethan Carver was for the first time in a very long time, entirely where he was. Some things don't arrive on schedule, some things take 10 years, and a hospital room, and a 6-year-old who loves too easily and asks too many questions to finally call you home to yourself. And some silences, once you finally break, them turn out to have been the only thing standing between you and the life you were always supposed to be living.